Red sa star, ein ceart atáige, ein drám, bhunar macha, trí strachad.
If we're talking about democracy or national self-determination, women needed to be part of this democratic change that was going to be taking place.
Se tá fólaí ein nuair tá rud wet go gaithú trid lena chintiú go bhuaithe. Nuair tá sé fáilte agat go gaithú trid arís lena chintiú go gonneotu agus inéire an lé nachfuil deire leis se trid má támuid a caint ar stádas nó ceartan am rá. Hig mrá, mar a méidí sin an vótáil, go méidí sé gcónaí tíomh mo don sochaí, go méid siad fágaí ar leatíomh go raibh siad mar chain éanric tíomh mo don phróisis polaitiúil agus don phróisis sóisialta in an áit ina racónaí orthu.
Cén fá go raibh sé cotáchtach sin. Massam gur sór doras intrála ar saol poblí na tíre. Go bhéadh siad gach a bheith có san díospóireacht náisiúnta agus go bhéadh siad cócht a bheith có ag tuairt an vóta ag gur gluthanna áirithe. So bhí isacá go raibh sé láireach de gach éon rud.
Bhí mná agrathe go polaitiúil in sna 8 mar sinnda. Agus bhíidir a ddírig Votaí de Mhná. Agus ar nói is leistigh den riocht aonta a bhí sé seo go léir ar siúl. Mar is ón bparliamint ó Westminster bhíidir a ddírig go runthach Parliament Westminster an vóta ar Mhná.
Anna Haslam and Isabella Todd both were particularly significant in that early phase of the movement from the 1870s onwards. Anna Haslam was one of the signatories to the petition that John Mill presented to Parliament in 1866, seeking women's suffrage to be included in the forthcoming electoral bill.
The Bille Adultí Parliament Westminster, in ddírig an vóta an ceart vótála chuirt a leathanú amach, de dhaoine eile, d'ir ar nói. Agus thug John Stuart Mills isteach lasúda sin, a dathróg an Cliath ó fear go dtí duine ar nói níor éirí leis.
A couple of years later, Isabella Todd formed the first suffrage society in Belfast in 1871-72.
She also worked with politicians in order to get women the municipal franchise, and Isabella Todd led a deputation of women over to the House of Commons when that was voted on in order to persuade people to vote. She saw suffrage and women's ability to change laws as the only way to advance the kind of social reform that she wanted.
Siad tús leis an feachtas bunreachtúil stocha déanlach seo, bhí siad a chur brú ar pholaitiúirí, bhí siad a caint go faiblí ag an buinte seo agus ba rud nua é seo, agus margheallar sin ba rud radical é seo ag an buinte seo, ba ábhar nua é seo a bheith a caint faoi cearta sé bhéalta le haimrá. Is margheall ar an feachtas bhí acu siúd go bhór cailíní agus mrá an seans a dhuile se agus céim amhaint mans an ollscoil. Ní rá Haslam agus Todd an anna sin dhéanamh, mar bhí an áit sin beard hope siúd agus iad a fós níos.
But all the time at the back of their mind, they wanted to have the vote for women. But they looked upon it on a gradual process. If we can get a local government vote first, and gradually, Anna described it as ever so slowly pushing a door open wider and wider.
Mar chuoine tú ar Anna Haslam agus ar an nachma lena bhuineann sé. Mín cos sé saoil a déanamh maith do chuoine eile, cos sé saoil go carnach a pléiles na Bochtáin, a Éiri Amach, Mhná agus do Roimh ná raibh mar anna cosc. Agus bin dír an sais duine a cheapfá. Go mbeadh go gurfaí fáiltar na mar sin sa saoil poibilí. Ach tuisc a hinsne, tuisc gur bannaí chuach stop lethe.
Má smíonn muid ar tús na híise, fecinn muid gur dulchan cín sa réimse peblií, agus détá rá freisin gur dulchan cín dénta acu sa réimse príomháideach dá bhhar. Gur stádas níos airde acu ó híobs líide leiste den réimse pósta. Gur rá atá geall páirt níos éifeachtaí agus níos peblií is síl pobl agus polaitiúil. Rud a dag gur golóir dulchan cín dénta acu, ach détá rá freisin go nearna sé sin níos soléire gur sé tíomh hir I réimsí áid eile a bhí táhachtach.
I think there's growing frustration among particularly a younger generation of women who are middle class and who want to see the agenda pushed forward.
There was a new generation emerging. Women were able to go to university, and I think there was an expectation there that they would be able to get employed with their degrees, and they were confident and slightly different from previous generations.
Bhí si de gabar mar dhéachtóirí, mar doctóirí, mar cigarí, agus freisin táimrá mar chorleoirí dúchais óna 8 amach. Bhí sé sin tharbheith háhachtach chun mrá a spregú chun an céim eile a bhaint amach. Sin é an vóta pparliamint a bhaint amach.
The younger women were also very much influenced by the work of the Pankhurst WSPU in Britain, and by their methods and their use of colourful images to advertise the cause, and costumes and colourings and badges and all that type of thing. The flamboyance of that, they were taken with that very much.
Ní ráidir sásta leis an dulchan cín a bhí déanta, dar leo ní a bhéon dulchan cín déanta leistigh de trocha bliain. So bhíidir sanna bhd níos radací, bhd éiring níos radací, agus bhíidir sásta dul amach ar na sráidne, mó díreach a thógan mar dearfa. Bhíidir réig, éonmh dhéanamh ná riar bhíidir anna hásta dul amach agus trid go fiocfar ar son a gcearta.
Nuair a bhreaíonn muid ar an taimseir seo is stair na hÉireann, tá muid a breanna ar cheisní nuair ó rá mórchaint faoi chearta, agus gur mórchaint faoi féin rialtas.
This is the third attempt to get a Home Rule Bill through the House of Commons, and this would mean limited self-government for Ireland. What was really important was that if Home Rule was going to be passed, it had to also include women. Some of them talked about Home Rule for Irish women as well as Irish men.
Tá sé deachrann lá aniu anna hiiscint cén bailach go bhéh tá labhairt faoin cheist sin gan aitheanta sa bheith agat ar chearta le faoin ghéad don déanra sa tír, sé sin am rá.
The problem was that the Liberal government was a minority government and it was being kept in power by the Irish Party. And the Irish Party's whole emphasis at this stage was to win independence.
Ceapadar go mbeadh sé Bhéalach go dámbeadh na Mhná ag Clausán má dheall ar cén fannach bhfuil an vóta a gcuinge. Go leitigh sé an scéim a bhí aige dá mbeadh sé géirigh fochlás a chur isteach meall ar Votaí na man.
The Prime Minister, Asquith, didn't support women's suffrage, nor did John Redmond, the leader of the Irish Party, and so women's suffrage becomes completely intertwined with whether or not Ireland's going to get Home Rule, and the Irish Party makes a very cynical decision, which means that any bill about suffrage that comes to the House of Commons, they decide to vote against for fear that the Liberal government will be brought down and you'll have a Conservative and Unionist government that will never give Home Rule to Ireland.
Maia cymryd ar na helmintí difriúla. Bhí an feimnachas, sé sin an cearta do Mhná go háir cearta bhótála. Tóga míist hena sé hí scefning mar hampla. Déir far agur feimnach é sin go príomhga. Bhí na an poblachtánaachas nó na náisiúntóirí, sé sin ceart an náisiúnta nas blachas. Conas Markovich mar hampla in 1910, thug sí caint agus dúirt siad nárthastig suffrageoí ach a bháin mar chuid de hiirse omláin na tíre. Mar an chéad ceart a bhíle buint amach ná ceart don tír. Ban ceart leor ach ban éarnach a bató dar le sin. Agus ar nói an tríú pís an san ná an sóisialachas. Fiú bhain Louis Bennett.
Louis Bennett was born into a wealthy middle-class Dublin family. The first issue she got involved in was the suffrage movement in 1911 when she started the Irish Women's Suffrage Federation. But the other issues she was involved with during the course of her life were the labour movement, pacifism and anti-militarism.
Má bhí éon faointe aitheantais atar ar fad an glúiseachtaí sanna lei. Ná go ráidir i lig aontaithe vótaí a thuirt a bhaná ar an gúsin go gafií vótaí a bhaná a bhaint amach gan bhail.
So you had these varying interests. While they would cooperate on certain issues, they had different priorities as to what type and when they wanted that suffrage. And of course some didn't want to upset the union at all. People like the Haslams, they were quite happy with the way things were.
There's a real watershed by 1912 as the Home Rule Bill seems more and more likely to pass, and it looks more and more likely that women will not be part of it. So, for example, they go to Redmond to try and reason with him. He says he doesn't support women's suffrage.
So, dúirt agus bhí sé sort fór, dúirt nach raibh sé chunaí anamh agus bhí aséantas asan amach idir Glúiseach na Mhná agus John Redmond.
You have people like John Dillon, John Redmond's lieutenant, who says very clearly that in his eyes women's suffrage would herald the ruin of Western civilization, and he's completely opposed to it.
It's saléir, you know, go raibh John Dillon, go raibh sé sort aglaach bheall na mná bheith amach sa saoil fa bli. Bhí lán fearg an am sin, agus a lán mná chuma a ceap go raibh an stáid a bar the van na festival as mar sin de.
My grandmother, Hannah, she's Skeffington, she had a very strong sense of women's rights. She would have been a feminist, even though they didn't use that term at that time. And she had a very clear mind. She was a very good kind of leader and had very great clarity of purpose in her activities and thought. In 1908, Hannah, who was part of a younger generation, and Margaret Cousins, decided that they wanted to do something a little bit more proactive, and they were sitting around, I think, after a meeting with Hannah's husband Frank and Greta Cousins' husband James Cousins, and they decided to found a new suffrage organisation, and this was the Irish Women's Franchise League. And they were kind of had an eye to the WSPU in England, and they were more proactive in England, and they thought, well, I think we need to be more vocal, more public, and this was the start then of a movement where they would speak publicly anywhere. And it was nearly always the women who did the speaking. They learned, by experience, addressed the crowd, which was sometimes friendly and often there were hostile hecklers.
The membership of the Irish Women's Franchise League were anxious to assert their separate identity, were anxious to assert their Irishness, and that they were campaigning for votes for Irish women, and that they were going to do it in a particular Irish way.
The women's activities, of course, were useful, but it was also important that they be covered in the press. And Frank was a journalist, but he wasn't always able to get published in all the papers. And there had been other papers that were covering it, like Ban na Éirinn.
Bhí an pápéir sin anna himúil mar de cheise ar son ceart na Mhná, so bhí PC an marall ar vótaí do bhaná na rudí bhí atharlóint in Éirinn, agus a Sasna, agus na difríochtaí a bhí atra son. Go mórmhór tháinig ceist an náisiúnlachais chun tosaigh an son, ar chóir gur fé an bhéim ar nas blachas na tíre, agus hirshe náisiúnta nó hirshe na man. A cumáile sin bhí písí mar sóisialachas, féin gaelachas agus mar sin de, agus cumáile sin bhí recipes an, bhí písí marall ar cuasaí bíg, ar an dig agus mar sin de, so bhí sé anna himúil agus bhí sé díortha scríofa ag agus díortha ar bhaná.
Frank decided to start his own newspaper, and himself and Jim Cousins founded the Irish Citizen, which was founded in 1912. And then it was a suffrage newspaper and covered any of the activities in the background to the suffrage movement. And the name even was a statement, because citizenship implied a republic. So this was a statement in itself. But also there was a banner headline just under the title which said, "For men and women equally, the rights of citizenship. For men and women equally, the duties of citizenship."
You can't overestimate the importance of that journal for both the women of the time and interested men of the time, but it was very, very interesting. And the fact that it went across the country at a time when nothing else did was crucial.
Suffragists have a fundamental problem in that they're seeking to achieve reform through Parliament. But to achieve reform through Parliament, it's very important that you actually have the vote in the first place to achieve that reform. So they end up constantly running up against the reluctance of Parliament to introduce reform. There's a gradual growth in militancy. It doesn't arrive in one big bang. Women begin by heckling ministers or heckling politicians.
Thosaigh siad ar na demonstrations móra in London agus Chéad Mhná ón tír seo hall an sin freisin agus bhí siad an mór.
And there were cases, say, for instance, when there'd be some major politician like John Redmond addressing an indoor meeting in a theatre, and that it all worked out in advance, that at certain points, at kind of 20-minute intervals, they'd all kind of get up and shout votes for women at the podium, and of course they'd be unceremoniously escorted out. So this was the way the militancy developed gradually.
Ríist níarna sé sin mór an difriocht agus héis nuide go dóigh thosaigh sais an darna chuid gon scéil seo na militeochaí nó na suffragettes.
In 1912, suffragettes from all over Ireland and trade union organisers and women from different walks of life came along to attend this mass meeting to appeal to the Irish Party that women be included in the Home Rule Bill that now looked very strongly imminent. At the end of the meeting, they put a petition together. A number of the key speakers signed it, and it was sent to all Irish MPs and to all of the cabinet ministers, and they didn't get a response from any of them.
This was a petition by united women in Ireland, and it was ignored. So by this stage, there is no democratic avenue left for women to keep making their point. And it was after that that the Irish Women's Franchise League said, we are going to now turn to direct action, to militancy, to make our point.
A few of them agreed to smash windows and in public places, and I think some of them went down to the forecourts, and Mhná volunteered to smash windows in Dublin Castle because she said that's the seat of British power and I want to have a double go at this. Make a strike for freedom, if you like, as well as causing a bit of disruption. So she went to the back of Dublin Castle in the Ship Street entrance and broke some of the windows. As a result of this, Mhná was brought to court, stood trial, and she was one of the first. There were a batch of them, and she was one of the first to be imprisoned, sent to prison for several months.
Cén fágur am rásásta an lí a bhrise dul tíh modern lí iad héna chur os córan lí cheist vótáil. Agus lei sinna hiiscin camid eiceal gur glór eile déanta acu suas go dtí an puinte sin bhealach go béise an ráha dearnach a bhí acu, ní rá ahrú bonúsach tagas de góras agus iad a gobar leistíh an chóras. Bhín chóras úsáidtí acu ach níor aibre an chóras ar a son. Dag sé sin go rá ortha an sin breanna agus an lí a bhrise.
One of the more significant elements of the Irish militant suffrage story is the development of a prison campaign. In the UK as a whole, just over 1,000 women would go to prison during this period. In Ireland, 27 women go to prison, and they go on about 35 occasions. Some women are jailed on multiple occasions. The first imprisonments take place in the summer of 1912, and imprisonments continue until the outbreak of the First World War in 1914.
One of the things that they were very clear about was that they were political prisoners, and they actually wanted to emphasise that from prison because this was a political action.
The authorities de facto, if not de jure, recognised that these women were different, and they afforded them effectively a political status, not in law but in practice.
In July of 1912, Prime Minister Asquith comes to Ireland in order to reassure the Irish people of his commitment to Home Rule. Irish women knew that Asquith was coming over. They also knew that this was a very delicate time. They didn't want to do anything that would antagonise the Irish Party supporters, but they did want to make their views felt, so that, for example, when his boat was coming into Dublin Bay, they had a little launch that went out to meet it and with loud hailers called for votes for women. But, you know, it was something that was eye-catching but not threatening.
When will you give us the right to vote, Prime Minister?
The Women's Social and Political Union, the Pankhurst organisation, as part of their campaign, sends over 3 women to follow Asquith and to make their own protests.
They throw a hatchet at a carriage in which he and John Redmond are travelling, and also they attempt to set fire to the theatre in which Asquith is due to give a pro-Home Rule speech. The women are arrested.
And they promptly went on hunger strike. And this was interesting because the Irish suffragettes this was their first time being in prison. They hadn't really thought through whether they were going to do hunger strike or not. They were just following their time. They were political prisoners. And then suddenly there were 2 English women on hunger strike.
And this raises big questions for the IWFL women who were then in prison, 8 of them in Mountjoy. What should their attitude be? When they had gone to prison, their position was that they would only hunger strike if Irish women were denied political status in Irish prisons. But now they have these other women who are in prison and who are not receiving a political status. So how should they respond? Slowly, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington comes to the view that Irish women should strike in support of their English sisters.
She has this memory of, it wasn't easy and not feeling well, obviously sick and nauseous, and also they never knew at any point they might have been force-fed, and she says she remembers hearing the footsteps coming down the corridor, and would this be a team to come and force-feed them or not? So she didn't know. So she did 5 days of hunger strike and was released. So, she'd kind of done her time. The other women were released around the same time. As soon as they were released, the English women were force-fed.
Forcible feeding was a very distressing procedure, and both the Irish militant suffragists and the Irish prison authorities were anxious to avoid it if at all possible. Suffragists had experienced it in Britain. They didn't want to see it used in Ireland, and the prison authorities were very conscious of the bad publicity and the controversy that its use is likely to generate in Ireland.
And this made it clear that the government, the British government, was afraid to force feed the Irish women on their own territory. They were terrified because they had obviously got quite a lot of support. but they were not loath to force feed English women on Irish territory, or indeed Irish women in London as well.
Later on, then, come late 1912, early 1913, you see the authorities seeking a solution. And the solution they seek is to try and isolate the suffrage women away from other prisoners and from their supporters in Dublin. So they start to imprison women in Tullamore prison.
Whilst we ourselves are quite prepared to go back to Tullamore.
And then finally, the last phase of imprisonment really emerges in 1913 with the passing of the Cat and Mouse Act, which facilitates them in releasing women who go on hunger strike on the basis of ill health, and then bringing them back to prison again to serve their sentence. This doesn't actually emerge in Ireland because the Irish authorities tend not to pursue the second half of the equation, so to speak, so they don't rearrest the women and bring them back to serve their sentence.
Cuiníimiid ar an stalgachris mar arm polaitiúil, cuiníimiid ar láithreach ar na poblachtánach agus príosúnach poblachtánach. Ach nuair a hen tú siar sa stair, cíadtó gur bíad na suffragettes a bhí chun túiscin son, an son James Connolly.
James Connolly was arrested in 1913 during the lockout, and he went on hunger strike, and he said to his daughter, any weapon that the suffragettes use is good enough for me.
Agus ar nóid an son tús an Chéad Chogaidh Dhomhanda, chuig Frank Sheehy Skeffington, fear céile Hannah, chuig sesin ar stalgachris I gcoinne an chogadh mar pacifist a bheith siúd.
He goes on hunger and thirst strike and wins his release very quickly, and he makes it very plain again that it was a weapon that was first adopted by the suffragists.
Ar nóid ar chuiníonn tú ar chogadh na Saoirse agus an tréis an díor tréis nédig sé déag, tá ceangal nasc an a láidir idir an dá glúiseach san. Agus is stoilm go macóir a bhad níos mó ar a thuirtar sin.
Fecinmuid an bhean mar duine atá ciún, duine atá sochar, duine a héans leis a góras, ní héan mrád an chuide smó I gunne an chóras. Céir de chonig muid len amrá seo, hí amrá seo mílete, hí siad sásta fós agus a gorp héana úsáid I gunne an stát. Agus tá tíbhá sin an cuachtach agus tú lorug rudicínta tá polaitiúil agus dachar a bhainteach.
Bhris amach an Chéad Chogaidh Dhomhanda mí lúnasa nuide go cairdeag, chur an chuideas mú gus na suffrageí an feachtas ar leathíomh.
Al thocraigh na Pankhursts go gurfaí stop leis an agóidíocht ar fad ar san Votaí do Mhná, le ling an Chéad Chogaidh Dhomhanda mar bhíad ar dírig chur leis an mór effort mar thug le bhíad ar dírig a bheith tíorghách agus mar sin de. Thaspáinte go raibh Mhná in an rudaí dhéanamh. Náiríonn siad Hannah mar bhína fir amos na tríntíí amos sa rank a trid, so dhéon na Mhná obair ag baile ná raibh Ceadachá a dhéanamh Hannah. In Éirinn ní a bhálaigh an cás, lean Louis Bennett agus an Irish Women's Franchise League leanar san araig a chur brú ar bheithe le Votaí a bhaint amach do Mhná.
The Irish Women's Franchise League immediately had a headline in the Irish Citizen, "Votes for Women Now, Damn Your War." But a lot of the other suffrage groups, in fact, supported the war effort. The Irish Women's Suffrage and Local Government Association organised money to have a bed for wounded soldiers in Dublin Castle. The Munster Women's Franchise League organised an ambulance to be sent to France. People who didn't feel like that, Louis Bennett, for example, wrote to Hannah, "Everyone here seems to be knitting socks and trying to see what they can do to support the soldiers." For Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, this was really devastating. Governments now would try to get women, she said, to roll up the map of suffrage. Women had to continue fighting for votes for women in the hope that if women had the vote, it would be the end to that kind of war fever and belligerency.
Bhí drama bháinna bhí gníomhach sa suffrage, sin Frank Sheehy Skeffington, Louis Bennett, agus Viidir san gomóri guineh an Chéad Chogaidh Dhomhanda mar pacifists a bahiad.
In 1915, there were a series of articles published in the Irish Citizen by both Frank and Louis in relation to the Irish volunteers, and they indicate quite clearly that while both favour an independent Ireland, they don't want it achieved at the cost of violent methods.
There are public meetings being called to talk about what does war mean, do we want peace, what kinds of peace do we want, how can we organise for that.
Frank was a pacifist, so he wasn't just opposed to the British Army and the British action in the war. He really didn't think that taking up arms was the way to resolve the issues over the nationalist question. And he published this open letter to Thomas MacDonagh.
Thomas MacDonagh talks about his efforts now as the director of training of the Irish volunteers, that he would be doing something that will, in the end, he hoped, stop war and would give women the vote. But what they were going to do was fight against British rule in Ireland.
He was writing to his friend, but in a public address, and he was saying, I'm glad now I didn't join the volunteers, I didn't join for feminist reasons, but now I find I can't support this increasingly militaristic approach that you're taking.
Mother leis an element radacach, Dínar Nós Markovich mar hampla. Négur sí gine an Chéad Chogaidh Dhomhanda bocuma lehe. Connig sé sin mar yes. Deis England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. Go raibh seansanis ag na náisiúntóirí ag na poblatánaigh bhuile a bhóla ar hasna in am gátar. Agus saoirse ní bháin saoirse na mana bhaint amach ach saoirse a bhaint amach den tír nas blachas a bhaint amach.
Shortly before 1916, Louis Bennett and Frank Skeffington took part in a debate which was addressed by Constance Markievicz on the theme of do we want peace now? Obviously, Louis and Frank spoke on the basis of wanting peace. Markievicz would have had a different viewpoint, but James Connolly was at it too, and he came in towards the end taking the Markievicz stance that the continuation of the war was in Ireland's interest, and that that seems to have swung the balance in relation to the vote that was taken at the end. And Louis was horrified to see that from the attendance of approximately 600, only a handful supported Frank Skeffington's side. And she wrote later saying that there's a spirit of despair that comes over me that is in Ireland at the moment. I think she knew in her heart the way things were going to go, that there was something in the offing, and she wasn't happy with that.
Nuair a cuireadh tús leis na volunteers in Éiri Amach mar ragra ar the Ulster Volunteer Force, bunaíodh Cumann na Man. Ceap ná áirithe go raibh ról na difriúla le déanamh ag Feireadh agus ag Mhná. Ceapadar go raibh cóin is a gceist ach nar áidir álaigh.
Hannah Skeffington and others feminists within the Franchise League felt this was an extremely retrograde step. You were now going to have a body of women that would collect money for the men to spend, would roll bandages or do what was needed.
An rud a hála an son le Mhná radacach ar nós Helena Maloney abermist, nuair a bhunaigh Connolly an Irish Citizen Army, códar son, isteach an son in áid Cumann na Man.
Those women who identified as feminist within the nationalist movement see the citizen army as offering the opportunities that Cumann na Man doesn't have. So you have Constance Markievicz, you have Kathleen Lynn, and a host of other women. Markievicz talks about the fact that they had to go on route marches and there was no difference in terms of the kind of training and treatment that they had. James Connolly is also a very close friend of the Skeffingtons. Connolly realises that Hannah is somebody who would support the insurgents. And he actually says to her, if you're thinking of going away at Easter, I'd advise you not to do so. And then he says to her that if things are prolonged and they set up a civil provisional government. She was going to be part of it. So she was the only woman who was going to be part of it, but it shows you the kind of esteem that she was held in by the leadership of the rising.
Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which he receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland...
Is dóilm ná churmid an bhéim is ceart thionnachar an iminachas néadaigh sé déag mar hampla, agus go háirithe órógra na cosca néadaigh sé déag. Nóir chluis mé fiúháin an chéadálína Irish men and Irish women. Ba rud ábhór é sin.
Hannah Sheehy Skeffington said of the proclamation that it was the first time in history that men fighting for freedom voluntarily included women. And I think you have to see it in that context.
So it's document feminachis an éineacht áirisa. Agus tá in fact Kathleen Clark der sí héin go raibh gach éan duine das na daoine a chur an animacha leis an bharógra I bhábhar hiirse na man vótaí do bhanáibh a go bháin duine bháin na ní luúin sé cén duine. Bheadh mis Éirinn Amach nach an píorsach mar bhí sé sin lán fábhrach do vótaí do bhaná. Joseph Mary Plunkett bhí sé sin na post Grace Gifford a réist feminach suffragette bahí sin.
Kathleen Clark obviously didn't suspect Tom of being the signatory. James Connolly was certainly not the person. Eamon Cant was, I wouldn't have thought, the person. His wife Anya had been a very active member of Cumann. And then again Thomas MacDonagh, close friend of Frank Sheehy Skeffington's, and he had already said categorically he, for his part, supported women's suffrage. So if you take all of those out of the picture, you're only left with Sean McDermott. And it's a process of elimination, not that there's any evidence to say that it would have been him. He could have been influenced by, for example, John Devoy over in America, somebody pulling a lot of the strings, not necessarily somebody who would in any way have seen the women's suffrage movement as an important part of what would have seen simply as an Irish independence movement. It must have been quite extraordinary to have heard Pearse at the steps of the GPO when you think of the years when Irish women hadn't been able to be part of any political discourse.
Tá sé sin síos is dóilm obair polaitiúil na man agus na bhar a bhí ina suffragettes cumá céanna le bheith ina sóisialach, cumá céanna le bheith ina déanlach, cumá céanna a bheith ina réamhlóide.
GPO and was involved in getting food and messages around, and Frank found people looting and being disruptive on the street, and he saw this as rather disrespectfully representing the Irish people. So he tried to recruit a number of people to try and stop the looting. And on Tuesday evening he was walking home and he was arrested, and he was brought into the barracks in Portobello and held, and then in the evening he was taken out as a hostage because the people knew him, and so if there was any sniping at the patrol, then they felt they were safer because he was the hostage. They met a couple of young lads coming from the church in Rathmines, and apparently Bowen Coulthurst, who was captain, ordered one of his soldiers to strike this boy Simon Code on the head and knocked him down on the ground. He was knocked down, and then Coulthurst pulled out a pistol and just shot him dead. And Frank, of course, started to protest, and Coulthurst realised that this was a journalist who had witnessed something. And the next morning he took Sheehy Skeffington out, and he took also 2 other journalists, unionist journalists, and they were shot as well. So the 3 of them were just taken out and executed. So this was just cold-blooded murder. And in fact Hannah was not told about it at all, and she didn't know what had happened to Frank. And eventually the father of Code sent a message back saying he'd identified the boy in the morgue and he'd seen that Frank, she's Geffington, was there as well. So this was terrible news coming through to Hannah.
Louis Bannet hoped that his death would do more to weaken the militarist system than perhaps had happened in his lifetime. Both he and she had shared views that militarism was the ultimate enemy of feminism. She was just shaken to the core, and there's no doubt that he was one of the first prominent casualties of the 1916 Rising.
Bhín daoine áirithe cabhanús ar na mnánéideag sé dé go rá ná bhíidir sa chistin, bhíidir sanna déanamh té fadas a bhí na fear scoile.
The only outpost that women weren't at during the Rising was Boland's Mill, and famously Eamon de Valera was the commandant there, and he had sent women who reported for duty away. So it's very interesting when you see somebody, for example, like Margaret Skinner during the Easter Rising as part of the Stephen's Green contingent. What she would do when she was active was she would put on her citizen army uniform and take off her first aid uniform. She saw a distinction between those two roles.
Bhí Markovich an tarna duna Ganis ar an Irish Citizen Army. Bhí gunna ina láimhithe, bhí si scuile léthe. Mar chéile le go leordas na mnáid a bhí páirteach san ICA códa go fecha Stephenna. Mar chuid lánach den ní raibh sin na tarlaint in éonáid eile ag an am. I mean, burlud réomhlóideach ar fada. An rud maithe sin ceist eile.
And you had Kathleen Lynn, a lieutenant in the Irish Citizen Army at the Dublin Castle outpost. And after the death of Sean Connolly, it was left to Kathleen Lynn as the officer to surrender. The British Army officer that she surrenders to says he doesn't think he can take surrender from a woman, and he has to go and consult first of all, because this is completely unprecedented.
Is minic ag an am go raibh na mná ógasá bhíidir a chur a maithe I mhail. Bhí Sheila Humphreys is cuinnam go nuirtí go curach amach ar teachtarachtaí go raibh ar hídalmach I lár na sráide agus na sasnaigh a scuile. Agus hiic sí go raibh a saoil I mhail. Ní dom gur cóir an éachar féchant ar ról na man mar rud éigent tar na láimhe nó rud éigen ná raibh ar cócéim leis na fear. Tá sé súinte gur bhí Countess Markovich an taon bhean a tugach os cóir na gúirt na militants an na court marshals na Canary leis na Canary eile. Agus cúisiíochaí ar ná déarach chun báise fuair as ciúntachaí ach níor curach chun báise. Ar an mán agus ar an gúis gur bhean a bheithí, solely and exclusively because of her sex. Ní raibh Markovich í hain leanás ásta ceapte go sin mí chuthair mar fada. Go raibh sí cólárnach an san nudas bhí aon duna is na fear agus mar sin chuna héamnach a chun So ar a lí hábháil a hinsne an mion sin I dhéobh na man gur daoine eisceachtúil iad, gur bíad an drám leagaíad agus mar sin. So bhar sé.
Women got the vote in 1918. Women of 30 with property qualifications were able to vote in parliamentary election for the first time.
Deirtar gur Bhéal go raibh mrá ag obair mar siúránaí go raibh rolls éagsúla acu le líonann Chéad Chogaidh Dhomhanda gur is Bhéal sin go bhfuair siad an vóta in 1980. Tá sé deacair sin ará go trín, bhí sé chun atharla. Tá muidir cáint faoi déanlachas faoi an fiú Chéad Chogaidh.
Haspáin Mhná gur a bhiú vóta chuirtáibh. Haspáin idir gur ádarán an am an gátar in Sasanna. Agus chuidigh sé sin go mór leis an vóta chuirtáibh fémar na hála in éideag a 18.
The 1918 election is always seen for women as being the great breakthrough. Constance Markievicz becomes the first woman in Britain or Ireland to be elected. Obviously, as a Republican, she doesn't take a seat in the House of Commons. She ends up as a member of Éirinn.
Agus anam níochaí mar ara le cuasaí séir ara héthar a bheith sa Chéad Chogaidh. Agus rís nar chuointear sin bar rud fíor réabhlóideach sin. Ban, sóisialach, radacach, réabhlóideach, agus íana hara stáit, nó nar a bhéon stát an fiú ag an.
Is a léir damsa, go dtíine anna bhór í, ó héamh simbal, agus ó héamh cótha, saoirse, agus ó héamh, an ról a ghlach sí mar saidúr in éideag agus a séideag. Tá rud éigean ag buint le Markievicz agus an sort drama a bhí haar timpeall iarthaí.
Why was there only one woman elected? What happened to all the other talented women? Hannah Sheehy Skeffington wanted to be a candidate, and they are perfectly happy to put her up.
And she was offered a seat, and it was in the north, in North Antrim, which is a long way from Dublin, to whatever chance she had of being known in Dublin. She said this is unwinnable, and it was quite obvious that these were seats, the other women, there were others involved, that the men didn't want.
So in the Markievicz constituency, Markievicz is actually in jail during this. It's women who see the importance of campaigning for Constance Markievicz to be elected. And so the women of the Franchise League and women of Cumminaman come together to make sure that that campaign is a good campaign.
Ceannas nó bhí smú a dhéanam impressionarmsa féin dréimhse sé ná gur I dáchán éideag go 18 a bhótáil ana haslam den géadú riomh na saoil. Bhean a cá 3 scór bliain le go saoil ar fad nach mú. Is stracail agus a trid ar son Votaí a bhaint amach do bhaná. Agus féar a hiorthá go bhúr sí an seans sin dar isteach agus a bhóta caitheamh agus é níos nóchar ó d'aigid. Gur bhar sí agus gur bhain siach a bhíomhaí cúis a saoil.
The situation in terms of women's representation improves slightly for the second Dáil when you do have a number of women who are elected. So you have 6 women then. It's still a tiny amount.
Agus an rud atá simúil faoi sin ná ar bhealachar just high point áide sin, mar bhí ní rá sé go dtí 1967 blianta fada ina dhé sin go rá séisir mrá tofa a rís go dtí an Dáil. Agus cheapá tar éis an tagóid ileag na hiireachtaí ileag a rinneú le na chinú go bhuifií mráisteach go bheice an tíbhir sin a gardú blian a ní blian, ach ní mar sin a hála.
When the Free State came into existence, things were changed insofar as there now is adult suffrage with no property qualification. And on paper, things look terrific for women. Unfortunately, over the coming 15 years or so, there was a series of regressive legislation which forced women back into the home and out of their paid employment.
Obviously, this reaches its high point in terms of the 1937 Constitution, which affirms the primacy of women's role within the home. But that starts at a very early stage till eventually women are struggling to be part of any kinds of public or work-based role indeed.
Crohíonn sé sin ceistení agus an cheist is móna céir de chiile sé an vóta a thuigeáil ag an am sin agus cén ahrú bunúsach a hála sa sochaí de mhór vóta a thuigeáil do bhrá. In áír in ar ahra aonrad gur tugadh ceart de bhrá vótáil, ach nach rá ahrú bonúsach I nearcha an sochaí stádas na rá. Agus gur scuilú lo vótáil gur tugadh an cheartúir vótáil ach nach rá míú polaitiúil nó sóisialta ag gceart sin bhealach bonúsach sa sochaí fiú an go dtí an látainneáin. Gúmuid fós stracha leis gceist seo stádas na man nach bhfuil an bhoncheis sin ahrú.